Welcome to the New Stack Agents, our podcast where all things AI and especially AI agents. And today our guest is Scott Carey, Editor-in-Chief of Lead Dev. And if you're listening to this live, please, by all means, ask questions on YouTube. If you're listening to it later, leave comments on the YouTube video, email us, however you want to get in touch with us. That'll work. And Scott, thanks for being here.
No, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Now, you and I have been in this journalism game for a while. How did you end up at Lead Dev?
Yeah, so I entered journalism about a decade ago and didn't really know what I wanted to cover, didn't know what beat to do. Just knew that I wanted to be a journalist. And I ended up writing about corporate travel. I wrote a column for a magazine called Business Traveler on how to make the most of your loyalty points for your airlines, which was a weird job to have as a 22-year-old journalist. And after a couple of years there, which I thought was the dream job, I thought travel would be the coolest industry in the world to cover. I was looking around and I had some friends that got into the technology sector and they were covering this boom in startups, especially here in London and in Silicon Valley. And that looked like the coolest thing in the world to me. It just really, really piqued my curiosity. And so I tried to kind of wedge my foot in the door. And a friend of mine, Sam Sheed, who recently was at LinkedIn News and used to be at Business Insider and various other places, he left his role at Tech World, which was the publication at the time. And I kind of gave him a call and said, I really want your old job. Can you give me a recommendation? And next thing I knew, I was in that role. It was a small, busy newsroom full of people about my age, all hungry, all kind of going after these stories of mainly what was going on in the startup scene in the UK at that time. And that it was a really exciting time. You were there through it as well. And so that was really my introduction to the industry. And I ended up, through hook or by crook, like these things you don't kind of plan, I ended up going down the enterprise SaaS kind of route. So I ended up covering Salesforce and SAP and Oracle, and I learned what ERP means. And weirdly enough, as it sounds, I enjoyed that. I thought that was really, really fun. And so I did that for a while. And through that, I really got to know, or I think I got to know developers. I really became fascinated by the job of software engineering, what makes them tick, and how it all works. I'm always interested in people's jobs. That's always been my kind of thing. I like business journalism. And so fast forward and I ended up at InfoWorld, which is another publication in that stable at what used to be IDG, which is now Foundry, really focused on developers. And I wrote a bunch of stories there that I'm most proud of about, what happened to Heroku and why did Docker split in half, and, what happened, or why did Kubernetes become Kubernetes and things like that. So I really started to build up some muscle in that area. And then this opportunity at Lead Dev came up 3 years ago where they were building out the media side of their business. So Lead Dev is a 10-year-old conference company at its heart. It runs conferences for software engineers who want to get better at the management and leadership side of software engineering. They want to run really great teams. And then in the pandemic, obviously running an in-person conference business became quite scary. And so they had to pivot hard. And one thing they wanted to do was become more of a full-fledged media company. So they wanted to publish content, to do the same aim, help engineers get better at leadership and management, and then kind of build that out into a full-fledged media company. So I jumped at that opportunity. It felt tailor-made for me, really. It was a sector that I loved, but a whole new set of challenges that I was kind of ready for at that point in my career. So been there ever since, trying to kind of achieve that.
Yeah, it's funny how we all kind of ended up in this enterprise beat without really looking for it. That just kind of came to us. It's funny how that happens. Now at Lead Dev, one of the things you do is you publish reports. You do surveys and publish reports. And the reason we're talking to you today is the recent report you've done on AI and developers and how developers are using AI, the AI Impact Report 2025. It's your first one so far. And that's really why we wanted to talk to you today, kind of about the findings from that. And I was thinking, we should just maybe start with some of the top line findings from that and talk about that a little bit. One of the main results, I think, is that pretty much everybody uses AI now in the world of developers, according to what you've found. Can you talk about that a little bit more, what you found there? Who are the developers who are using AI, and maybe also who are the ones that are still not using it?
Yeah, for sure. I'll use the most overused word in journalism, which is ubiquitous, because I did find that when I was reading this, that like AI usage amongst developers is pretty much ubiquitous. So only 2% of our respondents, we got a sample size of nearly 100, nearly 900 here, and only 2% are not or have no plans to use AI in their development process, and that could span anything from taking a model off the shelf and using it in various ways to using Cursor within your IDE, and anything all the way down the stack. And so I want to talk to those people because I'm fascinated by where they work and why they're not adopting these tools, because they really, really are the outliers here. And then on the flip side, yeah, this is just now part of what people are doing. And the reason we launched this report, the reason we wanted to do this survey, is because a lot of there felt like there was a gap in the ecosystem at the moment in terms of what the actual impact of these tools has had on engineers. So how has it changed how they build their teams? How has it changed how they spend their time? How has it changed how they feel about their jobs? And so, we haven't gone into the kind of usage and things like that. I think the best place companies to do that are the people who make the tools themselves, but we've really tried to get into a lot of the kind of impact that people in this industry are probably feeling now as these tools have become as ubiquitous as we've seen.
Yeah, and sorry, you broke up there for a second on my side here. One of the things that I found interesting, there's also those 2%. Like, what is your feeling? Who are those 2%? Because when you go online these days, you get the sense that there's kind of half of the developers are all in on AI, and the other half is just very negative about it, maybe isn't using it. But in your report, it's just 2%. Like, what's your sense there? Who are they?
Yeah, it's difficult to tell. There's definitely, you're definitely right. Like, I think that there are boosters and skeptics, and they're probably pretty evenly balanced. I speak to a bunch of them all the time, and they can be maddening in their own ways. In terms of that 2%, like, I would just have, like, my guess, and it would at this point just have to be a guess, is that they're either the very few very skeptical engineers who are working in organizations where they have enough influence to say, no, we're not doing this. So they must be working in small teams. They must have a lot of sway, and they're able to kind of fight against that rising tide. Or they're working in organizations that are so heavily cautious that they just have not been able to get this technology in the door because of some of the legal or security concerns that are still very real.
Yeah, it might be interesting to look at a follow-up there, kind of what are the reasons people adopt it and what are the reasons why they don't, right? Because that's it surprised me, that number, 2% for sure. What is it that people are actually using though? What are the tools that people adopt? What did you find there?
Yeah, it was a bit surprising, but Cursor was right at the top. We know that developers love Cursor. It has kind of quickly established itself as the kind of de facto favorite tool in this space especially when it comes to coding assistance, which is mainly what we think of when we think of AI in the development process. Second was GitHub Copilot, and third was kind of unnamed copilots. And because of the nature of the way we asked this question, there is a bit of kind of gray area there, because people could have been talking about GitHub Copilot, or they could have been talking all the various other copilots there are out there. I think if we did this again and we were able to kind of fix that question, with GitHub Copilot would probably be at the top. It would probably make a jump there. But they'd be fairly neck and neck. I think Cursor and GitHub Copilot are the two really, really popular coding assistant tools. And then there's the models. So your Codex and your Gemini and the models that developers are bringing in and kind of tweaking to their own needs. And then there's just like a real mushy middle of a bunch of kind of challenger tools here. from, your likes of Windsurf and JetBrains and Tab9 and Devin and Augment, these companies that are actually very loud in the market, seem to have kind of very small market share. And then the other one that kind of jumped out was just poor old Amazon. None of their products kind of jumped above 2%, even though they're making a big effort here.
Yeah, Amazon Q with 2% in your report is, given the amount of money they've put into that, must be not make them feel very good. I'm surprised to see
probably
that too.
Probably quite galling. I'm not going to feel sympathy for Amazon because they're doing okay, but
they'll be fine. They'll be fine. But yeah, I'm sure they're hoping for more than that as time goes on. But yeah, it felt like some of the like almost vibe coding tools were kind of at the bottom there, which makes sense, right? Like a Lovable and others, also Replit and some others. Because, well, the developers you talk to were professional developers for the most part, right? The enterprise. So it makes sense that maybe they're not using Lovable necessarily to build tools just yet.
Yeah.
What, if you think about the other area that was interesting to me was how are these organizations kind of allocating their money at this point for these tools? And I think there's some interesting finding that some are maybe even contradictory to some degree, but talk to us for a moment what you found there.
Yeah, I thought this was fascinating and a real hat tip to our friend Lawrence Heck to help do this research with us. I know he does work with you folks and he's really rigorous.
He does indeed.
Yeah, he's really rigorous in the way that he goes about things like this. And this was a really tricky kind of area to get at because you have various sizes of organizations allocating different levels of investment here. And so kind of parsing the stats here isn't the easiest, but what jumped out at me was that the majority of the investments at the moment are happening at the code editor or the model level. But then also, as you said, there's some contradictory findings there in that not many organizations are investing in security and observability tools, but the ones who are investing heavily. They're investing over $100,000 a year, US dollars. And so I think that reflects kind of maybe the skew of our audience towards professional developers, maybe working in larger organizations. And those organizations are the ones that are going to be making that size of investment. And then, as you would expect, the smaller organizations are just giving their teams a credit card and just saying, go out and try all of these out, work out which one makes you most productive and run with it.
Yeah, that's where we are, I think, with a lot of small companies. They're still figuring that out. But the security part especially, I thought was interesting because there aren't even that many tools out there yet to use. It feels like so early on in this whole scheme.
Yeah, maybe that's why they're expensive.
Yeah, maybe they can charge because there's only a few that are really good and people want to use. Yeah, for sure. But then also, you asked what other kind of things are organizations doing with AI outside of coding, right? Directly. And a lot of it, like if you think about the software lifecycle overall, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, but it didn't seem like people were actually using AI yet for things like testing, QA, and things like that.
No, it's kind of a constant frustration of mine and another friend of ours, Jen Riggins, who writes for you guys and writes for us regularly. She published a piece last week on Lead Dev called "Writing Code Was Never the Bottleneck," and the bulk of kind of time and effort and energy at the moment over the last couple of years has been put into how do we make the coding process quicker? How do we do autocomplete for coding? How do we use agents to aid in the coding process? And really, that I don't think that's the most impactful place. It's just the sexiest and most obvious place to kind of point the tools. And so what we found was that yes, 48% of our respondents were using these tools for automated code generation. And then there was a kind of mushy middle of what I would call like non-coding related tasks. So anyone who works in a white collar environment will be familiar with summarizing meetings or writing documentation or content, research, learning new concepts. Those were popular. 32 to 39% were using it for those kind of writing or like research based tasks. And then there's like a real drop off. And then you get down to like code reviews, 17%, fixing bugs, 11%, data analysis, testing and QA, IT operations. So, the idea of AI DevOps, all these things that, the vendors get really excited about. Our respondents aren't there yet. They're not kind of, they haven't worked their way down or through the software development lifecycle yet to kind of really point at those problems. And I find that frustrating because I think that's where they have the most impact or have the potential to have the most impact. But it's not there and off the shelf, and it's not where the vendors are focusing their attention.
You think that's the reason? It's just the vendors aren't quite there yet. The tools aren't there yet. Because, on the other hand, when I talk to startups in that field all the time who have tools to do that, or I talk to a service now that talks about IT, automations, operatings, they would argue the tools are there, right?
Yeah. I think the tools are there. They don't have the muscle of a GitHub or a Google or, those companies that are really dominating the space, OpenAI. And so I think there's probably a lot of frustration from those companies. And we speak to lots of them who are like, this could have a huge impact on observability, on our ability to spot vulnerabilities, in our ability to write documentation. It's ready made for some of these problems, but it just hasn't managed to get that cut through in the market yet in the way that code generation has, because I think code generation is a bit easier to get on the on-ramp. You can try it at low stakes pretty quickly. All that other stuff requires you to bed it in to your processes and into your systems, and that is what takes work and effort.
Yeah, and buy-in from the whole organization. You can't just install Cloud Code on your machine and get going when it comes to a lot of this life cycle stuff, for sure. Now, we talked a lot about code completion and the coding side of things, and most of your respondents argued that all of this makes them more productive, right? And I think for the most part, that was about coding. Now, I thought what was interesting, I think it was 59% said overall, kind of it made them at least a little bit more productive than before. But there was 26% who just didn't know, right?
Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting. It's like you're using these tools, but you're not sure if it's useful or not, if it does make you more productive. Like, can you put that into some context for us? Why you think that was the case?
Yeah, definitely. So Annie Kovacevic on my team, who kind of ran this report for us, her first reaction when the data came through was that there were a few instances in this survey, a surprising number of instances, where our respondents essentially threw their hands up and just said, I don't know, I'm not sure. And we're a couple of years into this shift, but I was surprised by how often they kind of responded with that kind of exasperated, I don't know yet. And I think that gets to what another finding in the survey, which was when we asked them what's the biggest challenge you're facing, the one that came out on top was our ability to measure the impact this is having. So I think that the reason a lot of people said they don't know is because they genuinely don't know, because they're engineers and they can't measure it. And so this idea of that feeling of productivity translating to actual productivity, I think that idea is starting now to be unpicked. I think that the survey that MITRE did this year was the beginning of a kind of shifting there towards understanding that feeling, that dopamine hit you get from accepting a suggestion and moving on with your life actually might not translate to real productivity. And the big problem here in engineering, for as long as I've been covering it, is that it's very, very difficult to measure engineering productivity. And so I reckon a good chunk of those 26% that said I don't know is because they don't know if anything makes them more productive, because it's really difficult to measure.
Yeah, and you're referencing that the other study where, developers thought it was making them more productive, but at least according to the measurements, it really wasn't, and often actually slowing them down, right? So it's really going to be interesting to see. And I haven't seen that replicated yet necessarily, I think. So it'll be interesting to see what that looks like as we see more of those studies come in. Now, the jobs themselves, too, that's another area that's been heavily discussed from the beginning, especially when it comes to using AI and what that means for bringing on junior developers, because everybody you talk to, at least over last year, that was definitely still the case, was saying that AI is now as good as a junior developer. I think that's still arguable necessarily. I'm not sure that's always true, but it's definitely getting better. But in your results, your respondents pretty much said that is the case, that what they're expecting is that their organizations will bring in fewer junior developers, right?
Yeah, and there is nuance here because of the way we've asked the question. Like, our respondents aren't saying that they think that's a good thing. They're just saying that that's what they think is going to happen. Mm-hmm. And I do think that there is probably a lot of frustration amongst the engineering management and leadership class, the ones in the middle, that this is the way that mainly executives are thinking about this technology. They're excited about the efficiencies that it can bring. And I think that's why we're seeing the kind of historically hard downward push on adoption that we haven't really seen with any other technology, especially since I've been covering the sector. And so I think that our respondents seemed pretty kind of like middling on this question, that they were resounding in that they thought that there will be fewer available jobs for junior engineers and that life will probably be harder for junior engineers when we got into the kind of detail of it, which is, that is, not surprising, but interesting to see it in black and white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the question then remains, how do you become a senior engineer if there's no junior engineers, right? I think that's a question that nobody has been able. And I've asked that to everybody from leadership at GitHub, Anthropic, other companies, and nobody has an answer for it yet.
No, it was the question that Camille Fournier, very renowned engineer, wrote the Manager's Path. It was a blog post she did a couple of months ago that was really just like, in her very typical way, it was just asking the question that we should all be asking, which is, okay, if you're not going to hire junior engineers, then who's going to be your senior engineers? And it's a maddeningly simple question that no one seems to answer.
That maybe their idea is that the models will be so good we don't need engineers at all anymore, which is not necessarily what. Well, go ahead.
That's always the answer. Wait for the next model.
Exactly. So in 2 years, we don't have a problem anymore because the models will be so good. Though I think the launch of GPT-5 showed us that maybe we've reached a bit of a stagnation point. I don't know. We'll see what happens in the rest of the industry.
Yeah, maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but we'll see.
Yeah, it seems to come at 2-year cycles where things kind of reach a spurt again. So we'll see where that goes. What I thought was interesting, though, is when you asked those developers what they thought were the skills most necessary going forward, or they thought people need to have going forward. The top skill was critical thinking, if I remember it right, but like a decent margin, right? Why do you think that is, and kind of what's the context there?
I think that kind of gets to the nub of the frustration that engineers who have spent time working with these tools feel, is that they can't think critically. And so
can anybody still at this point?
No. And I think that there's possibly a generational angle to this response, but I do think that there's a lot of kind of more experienced engineers that feel this kind of ebbing away of the key skill of engineering, which is being able to scope a problem, being able to find an elegant solution, being able to build a feedback loop, being able to kind of do all of the engineering stuff that isn't just writing lines and lines of code until 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I think that there's probably an anxiety and a feeling that these tools are unable to replicate critical thinking. So, there's probably a self-preservation element there. It's like if these machines are coming for my job, then how do I set myself apart? Well, I can think critically and they cannot until the next model, obviously. And then I think that there's also an element of kind of concern that these tools and their usage by the junior engineers we were talking about earlier, the ones who can get their foot in the door, it is ebbing away at their ability to think critically because they're just like mindlessly accepting the suggestions that it's given, or they're handing off their critical thinking capacity to a machine. And I think that worries people clearly.
Yeah. And then after that, I think it makes sense in your context too, is just architecture or architectural knowledge, like how to architect a program, a system was number 2, which makes sense, right? Because if the models can do the coding, then it makes sense that we still have to tell it what the architecture should look like, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, they don't have the context window to bring together various components. And so I think there's probably a bunch of engineers that are thinking, okay, like maybe we'll see the resurgence of the architect. Like architects have had they've got a bad rep over the last few years. But I do think that there's definitely a resurgence in interest in those skills in terms of like, okay, like if we're running a bunch of agents in the future who are kind of doing a lot of the coding, how do I kind of architecturally build that into my system safely? How do I bring all the components together? How do I think through the actual product? I think that that's why people are starting to think that that's going to be a more important skill in this age.
And a lot of respondents also said, if I remember this right, that they expect that their job will involve managing agents more than anything else going forward to some degree, right?
Yeah, we asked which AI-related skill are you going to personally focus on developing in the next year, and managing AI agents was top at 60%, above prompt engineering at 53%. And then coordinating autonomous systems and model optimization were lower down. So I think that there's definitely a good chunk, a majority of our respondents who feel like they're at some point going to have to manage a fleet of AI agents.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly that has changed. Now, talking about how quick things changed, the cutoff date for your survey was late June, if I remember it right.
Yeah.
All of this moves so quickly. What do you think the results would look like today, or where do you think there would be changes just after a couple of months now?
Yeah, I mean, this space changes extremely fast, and we almost certainly would get different results if we did the survey today. We would have done different results if we'd done it in July. I think that the first thing that pops into my head is that like usage of tools. So the one with cursor at the top, that deck probably would have got shuffled like fairly significantly. I think that the way that engineers are adopting these tools is happening at a breakneck speed, and they're basically kind of constantly running bake-offs of these different tools all the time to see which one's their favorite, to see which one works the best. And so I think that ranking would shift all the time if you kind of had it running live. And then the implications on jobs, I feel like that would only have got worse. So I don't feel like that is reversed in any meaningful way since June. I feel like the sentiment there continues to kind of move in one direction. Other than that, I just feel like the optimism, well, until GPT-5 came out, I feel like the optimism would have just continued to steadily increase. I think that as the new models come out, they do move forward. And I think that they, give the detractors less ability to detract, and they give the boosters more fuel to the fire. So yeah, at the moment, it feels like the direction of travel is kind of get on the train and try and work out the other stuff as you go.
Yeah, for sure. Any other surprises that we didn't talk about yet in your report? I pointed out the ones that I noticed as I was looking over it, but I'm sure you've got slightly deeper understanding of the material.
Yeah, I was kind of pleasantly surprised that the number one concern when we asked what's your biggest challenge that you have experienced with AI adoption over the last year. And the number one was lack of clear metrics to evaluate AI's impact on productivity or quality. We actually partnered with DX for this report, but DX came on, as the report was in stream. So this was a kind of happy coincidence because this is really their kind of area of expertise. They're spending a lot of time thinking about how we actually do start to put metrics behind these tools. How do we start to evaluate their impact? They're building frameworks. They're talking about stuff all the time. And so to see that come out on top kind of really reflects our audience, because our audience tend to be very kind of focused on measuring impact and optimizing things. They're engineering leaders. But it was also just kind of interesting to see it so far above anything else, like security concerns or hallucinations or legal concerns. And I do feel like if we had done this report a year ago, those concerns would have been higher up. I feel like weirdly, the kind of ethical security ability of the models to get things right concerns have like slowly melted away. Maybe because the models have got better, maybe just because like the direction of travel is only in one direction. But I thought that was fairly surprising that that's where people are. It's like, this is happening. We need to measure it. We need to figure it out, not hit the brakes. We've got to figure out these big concerns first.
Yeah, nobody's hitting the brakes, I think, right now.
No one is hitting the brakes.
No. Let me switch this up a little bit. How are you using AI in your daily work? You're not a developer, you're fellow journalist, but how are you using it?
Yeah, I use it like for a bunch of white collar things, like I mentioned earlier. So I find the most impactful thing is meeting summarizations. Like we're a Google shop and we use Gemini de facto now to take notes of meetings. And I find this especially useful for the meetings that I maybe should be in, but I'm not. For things going on in different parts of the business, I can get a really quick look at what was decided there, what was discussed, where I maybe wouldn't have got that visibility before because it would have taken too long, or I would have had to ask someone. And so I found that to be really, really useful. I massively resist using it for things that I possibly should as a writer and an editor. I've always been a really staunch advocate for writers doing their own transcription, and AI came for transcription years and years ago. Oscar AI was really early on this, and when I ran a newsroom, I would always say to the junior reporters, resist the urge to use these tools because you don't know what you've got until you transcribe, and it's boring and it is painful. But until you actually listen back to the recording, you don't actually know what your golden quotes are. You don't actually know what was said and how it was said. And so I would never know what my story was until I actually transcribed it. And so removing that from the process as a journalist worries me. You could get yourself in a bunch of hot water by doing that. Again, I would feel like if I was still running a newsroom now, I would be old man shouting at cloud if I told people to do that. But it also has this as a corollary to engineering, because when I talk to a bunch of engineers about like how they got into engineering, they all have a variation of a story of I started tinkering with, and it might be basic. Normally they were coding in basic. The generation who are now at the management level were kind of that generation, or they were playing around with their games console, or they were literally picking something apart. But they learned through pain. Basic was extremely painful. You could build and build and build and build, and then if the second last thing broke, you'd have to go all the way back to the start. Like the old Christmas lights used to be, where if one bulb went, they would all go. So that engineering, a lot of engineers learn through pain. And I do think that you learn a lot by learning through pain and trial and error. And if we start to remove that from various crafts, those crafts become less crafty. You become less excellent at them. And that worries me. I think that's a shame.
I agree, even though I'm a heavy Otter user, I have to say. Though if you're not in journalism, you may not use Otter, but it's kind of the transcription service that everybody uses because it makes it easy to see where you are in the text. And it's not perfect, but it's good enough. And I remember at one time at another company I worked for, before I came to the new stack, one of the business folks said, "Hey, do we really need this Otter transcription?" And there was basically a revolt in the newsroom. It's like, you want to take this away from us? You can take any money away from us, but you can't take Otter away from us. So it's I hear you. Maybe I need to do some transcriptions by hand again. I don't know.
I think Otter's actually fine because you're still doing the transcription. It's just making it a little bit easier, but you're still going back through it. It's just kind of streamlining it. And I think AI tools that do that are fine. I think the ones where you are handing something off, and we're starting to see more of this in engineering, like Copilot is moving in this direction way, but essentially you say, here is the task, go off and do it, put a PR in, and then I'll review it. That I find crazy, but we'll see how it kind of it's going to get someone in hot water eventually, but we'll see how that pans out.
Oh, for sure. Between that and security issues and other things, I'm sure there's a lot of people thinking about that right now. But I think our time is pretty much up for today. Scott, I really appreciate it. Appreciate you taking the time today to be with us. It's been a pleasure.
No, Frederick, thanks for having me on. Thanks for reading the report and asking me about it. It's been a real interesting thing to work on. And yeah, this is a space that's very difficult to keep up with, but we're trying our best.
For sure. And for those folks who might want to read the full report, let them know where to find it as well.
Yeah, leaddev.com, or you can kind of find me across the internet on, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and I'm sure I've been shouting about it at some point. But yeah, leaddev.com or leaddev on various channels, and it will be there.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Frederick.